The engine gave a final hum and settled into silence, the kind that made a neighborhood notice. A sleek black car, polished to a mirror's shine, rolled to a stop at the edge of a cracked curb. Its presence did not belong here, not among houses with peeling paint, rusted mailboxes, and lawns that had given up on being green. The car itself seemed like an intruder, too flawless for the tired street it rested on. The door opened with a slow click, and a man stepped out, tall, straight-backed, the kind of figure seen on magazine covers and financial headlines. Nicholas Hale, billionaire. The name alone carried weight. His dark jacket caught the afternoon sun, but his face, composed as always, carried something heavier, something he didn't dare show to the cameras that usually followed him. Here, there were no cameras, only him, only silence. His polished shoes touched the gravel, crunching softly as he straightened. But he didn't move forward right away. He paused, standing still beside the car, as if his body had suddenly betrayed him. His eyes, sharp and trained to calculate risk and reward in boardrooms, locked instead on the old house across the fence. The house he had once called home. The house he had left behind. A breeze swept past, tugging faintly at his jacket, carrying the scent of soap and dust from somewhere down the block. Nicholas set his hand against the car roof, grounding himself like a man stepping back into a past he had buried under skyscrapers and contracts. His thumb tapped against his palm, a small, nervous rhythm, the kind he hadn't done since he was a boy. Behind a hedge, whispers began, two voices, hushed but sharp. "Look at that car. Who's he here for? That's him, isn't it? The billionaire. No way. Way. That watch alone could buy the street." Eyes peered through curtains. Shadows shifted on porches. The air seemed to grow thicker, to heavy, ire, pressing down with the weight of unspoken questions. No one called out his name, but everyone knew it. Everyone wondered why he was here, on this forgotten block where success never came to visit. Nicholas's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected the stares, though he should have known. His return wasn't quiet. It couldn't be. A man like him couldn't slip back unnoticed. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and let the breath escape slow. He thought he'd come prepared, calm, collected, the way he entered every deal. But standing there, staring at the chipped fence, at the window with curtains so familiar it made his chest ache, he realized nothing could prepare him for this. The place was smaller now, worn down by years, but every detail struck like a memory made flesh. The squeak of the gate, the crooked step at the porch, he remembered them all. And then, movement. From the side yard, an older woman shuffled into view, carrying a bowl wrapped in a towel. Mrs. Dorsey. He remembered her too. Her sharp eyes spotted him first. She froze, her chin lifting slightly, part wary, part impressed. She didn't smile. Instead, she spoke in the tone of someone who knew dignity mattered here, even when poverty had stripped everything else away. "You looking for someone, sir?" The word sir hit him differently. Not respect, distance. A reminder that here, he wasn't the man in the magazines. Here, he was just Nicholas, the boy who had once run down the street with shoes too tight and dreams too big. He tried to answer, but no sound came. His lips parted, closed, then parted again. So he nodded instead. Just a nod, his eyes never leaving the house. The whispers grew behind the hedge, restless now. Is he really here for him? If that were my father, I'd... Shush, let them be. Nicholas shifted forward, each step deliberate, like he was moving through thicker air. His shoulder lowered, his jaw unclenched, his hands opening and closing at his sides as if he was relearning how to breathe. The air smelled of warm pavement, soap, and the faint salt of sweat. Somewhere, a dog coughed behind a fence. A radio crackled with a soccer score, the ordinary sounds of a poor neighborhood, sounds he had once known too well. But nothing ordinary about this moment. Nothing ordinary about the man who had just arrived, the billionaire at the edge of a street, staring at the life he had left behind, heart pounding like it was his first time stepping into a world he thought he had outgrown. And though no one said it aloud, the silence spoke for them all. Something is about to happen here. Isaiah Bennett stood with the bowl in his hands, careful not to spill as he shifted it from one palm to the other. The enamel rim was chipped, the inside filled with stew that still let off a thin ribbon of steam. His shoes had split at the seams, the leather curling away like it had given up, but his shirt cuffs were ironed crisp. Neatness mattered to him, even when there was nothing left to be neat for. The old man winced as he straightened, his back stiff, but he still managed a small nod of thanks to Mrs. Dorsey, who had pressed the bowl into his hands. "Take it inside before it gets cold, Mr. Bennett," she said softly. her voice holding both kindness and pity. She knew what it cost a proud man to accept charity. She had seen him struggle against it for years. Nicholas watched from the fence, his throat tightening at the sight. He had prepared himself to see change, but not this. Not his father's hands shaking as they held scraps from a neighbor. Not the way he tilted his head, humble and grateful for what should have been his by right. His chest burned with disbelief, with regret, with something so raw he had no name for it. He had faced shareholders ready to tear him apart. He had stared down competitors across polished tables. But this, watching this man who had given him everything bow his head for stew, this made his knees weak. The neighbors behind the hedge didn't help. Their whispers carried sharp as knives. Can you believe that? Bennett used to be strong as an ox. All those years he poured into that boy, and now look. The billionaire son doesn't even come home. Always the way. Parents suffer. Children forget. Nicholas clenched his jaw, the words sinking deep. He wanted to shout at them, to silence their poison. But how could he, when they were only echoing his own guilt? He had been gone, always busy, always promising he'd visit once the next deal closed, once the quarter ended, once the world gave him permission. But the world never gave permission, and the years slipped by. Isaiah turned, finally, as if he had felt the weight of the stare burning across the fence. His eyes found Nicholas's silhouette first, the tall frame, the stillness, the posture he could recognize even under a stranger's suit. His gaze froze, blinking as though his mind was slow to catch what his eyes already knew. For a moment, he looked like a man caught without his hat, bare, unprepared. The bowl shifted to his left hand, his right rubbed against his pant leg, nervous habit, old as memory. He opened his mouth to speak, then shut it, as though the word he needed was locked behind years of silence. Nicholas swallowed hard. His breath trembled. He hadn't meant to speak, not here, not like this, but the word slipped free anyway, fragile and breaking as it left him. Dad? The sound stretched in the air, thinner than a thread, yet heavy enough to pull every ear toward it. Mrs. Dorsey stiffened, her eyes darting between the two men. The whispers at the hedge stopped mid-breath. The whole street seemed to lean forward, caught in the tension of the word. Isaiah blinked again, shifting slightly as if steadying himself under eyes. Wait, his lips curved in the faintest polite smile. The kind he used when he wasn't sure what to do, but he wanted to be kind all the same. He cleared his throat gently, nodding to Nicholas the way he might nod to a stranger on the street. Afternoon, he murmured. The bowl of stew trembled faintly in his hands. He turned, ready to step toward the house, dignity intact even in silence. And Nicholas, frozen on the other side of the fence, felt the world tilt. For the first time in years, the power was gone from him. The world was not his to command. He was just a son, standing on the edge of a street, watching the man who had once starved himself so that he could eat, walk away with scraps. The whispers returned in the hedge, low and urgent. If that were my father, shh, let them be. Let the man stand first. Nicholas's fingers curled against the iron latch. His breath came heavy, each inhale like dragging air through stone. He didn't rush forward, not yet, but the choice hung there between them, heavy and trembling. The billionaire who could buy a city stood rooted in place, unsure if he even deserved to cross that fence. Isaiah shifted the bowl carefully, the towel wrapped around it slipping a little as he steadied his grip. The steam had cooled by now, curling upward in thin, tired strands, but he held it with the same care he might have given a feast. He turned toward the doorway of his house, a house that leaned a little to the left, a house that smelled of soap and starch because that was all he could afford. His shoes scuffed the gravel softly, and then he stopped because something in the air refused to let him take another step. Nicholas stood still on the other side of the fence. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, too sharp, too clean, out of place against the faded lines of Isaiah's yard. His jaw trembled, but his eyes did not leave his father's face. The years between them collapsed into silence so heavy it pressed into the ribs. Isaiah blinked, his brows drawing faintly together, as though the figure before him were some ghost wearing familiar shoulders. His lips parted, the faintest breath leaving him, and his voice, when it came, was low, rough, uncertain. Nicholas. The sound cracked like an old board beneath weight. The name carried disbelief, a question wrapped in memory. Nicholas swallowed hard. He nodded once, his throat too dry to trust words again. The neighbor's whispers prickled at the edges of the moment, rustling like dry leaves. It is him. Back after all these years. Look at Bennett's face. He doesn't even know what to do. Isaiah rubbed his palm against his trouser leg again, the nervous habit Nicholas had memorized as a child. The simple gesture struck him deeper than any headline ever had. He remembered being a boy, watching that same hand steady itself before pulling thread through a needle, before signing papers for school fees, before tightening a belt one notch thinner when there wasn't enough food. That hand had carried his future, and now it trembled. Nicholas felt his chest collapse inward, his lips parted, and this time the word was steadier, though it still scraped raw on the way out. "Dad." The word hung between them. It wasn't grand, it wasn't a speech, but it landed with a weight both of them felt in their bones. Isaiah's shoulders gave the smallest shake, a breath caught between disbelief and recognition. His eyes watered, not from age alone but from something long buried breaking the surface. Mrs. Dorsey cleared her throat beside them, as if to give the men dignity. "Mr. Bennett, best take that stew inside now before it's wasted." Isaiah nodded faintly, grateful for the excuse, though his gaze lingered on Nicholas. He almost smiled. Politeness had always been his shield when the world confused him. "Afternoon," he said again, this time softer, the syllables trembling with old love held back too long. Nicholas's throat tightened. He wanted to run forward to take the bowl from his father's hands, to say every apology at once, but his feet stayed planted. The fence between them felt higher than stone walls, heavier than steel gates. He could cross it in a step, yet he hesitated like it was a gulf he wasn't sure he deserved to bridge. The hedge rustled again. "If that were my father," one voice started, sharp. "Let them be," another answered, gentler. "Let the man stand up first." Isaiah shifted toward the doorway. Nicholas, desperate, reached for the latch. The metal was cool, tired, worn smooth by years of hands. His grip tightened, his breath shallow. His shoulders rolled back, but not with the arrogance of the man the world knew. This was different. This was the weight of a son carrying years of silence in his chest. The latch gave with a tired click. The gate swung open. Gravel shifted beneath his shoes. He crossed the small space slowly, each step careful, measured, as though he was walking through thick water. Isaiah's eyes tracked every movement. He didn't step away. He didn't offer the bowl. He just stood, trembling faintly, waiting. Nicholas stopped an arm's length away, his shoulders squared, but his eyes, bright now, too bright, gave him away. He wanted to speak, to explain, to pour out years of absence and regret, but words failed him. Instead, he gave the smallest nod, like an apology too fragile for sound. Isaiah returned it, the faintest dip of his chin, a father's way of saying, "We'll speak when the street isn't listening." The world outside leaned closer, hungry for drama. But all it got was silence. Silence that said more than shouts ever could. For the first time in years, father and son stood within reach of each other. No fortune, no cameras, no boardrooms. Just two men, bound by bloodless love, staring across the thin air that had once straw, etched into decades. And in that air, the story had already begun. The stew trembled faintly in Isaiah's hands as he turned toward the doorway. He hadn't said much, he never did when unsure, but the silence between him and Nicholas had already spread through the street like spilled oil. Everyone felt it. Everyone wanted to see more. Behind the hedge, the whispers came again, sharper now, the kind that cut even when spoken low. Bennett could have had a better life if he hadn't poured himself into that boy. Look at the boy now, richer than kings and only comes home when it suits him. Tch, he'll leave again, always do. The words slid through the air like splinters. Nicholas heard every one, his jaw locked, shoulders stiffening, but he didn't lash out. Not yet. Instead, he watched his father's shoes, worn thin, the soles flapping faintly as he walked. He watched the way Isaiah held the bowl, careful, grateful, never bitter. That was what broke him. Not the gossip, not the stares, but the quiet dignity of a man who had been reduced to scraps and still carried himself as if life owed him nothing. Mrs. Dorsey shifted beside the hedge, clearly uneasy with the crowd that had gathered without gathering. She tried to clear her throat, tried to hush them, but their curiosity was too strong. They pretended not to watch while watching everything, eyes sharp through curtains, breaths held behind fences. Nicholas's chest rose and fell unevenly. He wanted to shout, to tear through the hedge and silence every word. But what would that prove? He had been gone. He had been too busy chasing empires, too busy being the man on magazine covers, too busy to notice the years carving deep lines into the man before him. And now here he was, standing in his father's shadow, unable to erase the whispers that told a truth he hated to admit. Isaiah stopped at the doorway. He looked back once, just once, eyes settling on Nicholas with something unreadable, not reproach, not anger, something quieter, the same look he had used when Nicholas was a boy standing in front of him with a broken toy or a scraped knee, gentle patience, the kind that didn't need words. Nicholas's throat burned. He stepped forward, hand brushing against the scarred latch of the fence he had just opened, as though touching it could steady him. He didn't speak. The silence carried enough. The hedge rustled again. Did you see the way he called him Dad? Blood or not, Bennett raised him. And look what it cost. Hush, let the man breathe. Isaiah nodded faintly to Mrs. Dorsey, a gesture of gratitude. Then, with a soft, steady shuffle, he crossed the threshold of his small house. The door creaked open, old wood giving way. He didn't wait for Nicholas. He didn't ask him in. He simply entered, as though the choice was Nicholas's to follow or not. Nicholas hesitated, his heart slamming like a drum in his chest. His hand hovered above the gatepost, his breath shallow. The neighbors leaned forward in silence, watching, waiting. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the short distance. Gravel shifted under his shoes, the air thick with the scent of stew, soap, and dust. He followed his father into the dim interior, the old floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The whispers outside faded into a low hum. The street, curious and nosy as ever, strained to hear more. But for now, the story had moved behind closed doors. Inside, the silence deepened. The air smelled of starch and clean cloth, thin but sharp. The curtains were hand-stitched, frayed at the edges. A fan turned lazily, its squeak familiar as breath. Nicholas stopped in the doorway, his chest tight. Every detail struck like a memory pulled from the dark. The billionaire air had returned, and for the first time the house remembered him. The door closed behind them with a tired sigh, the kind a house makes when it hasn't been opened by family in years. The sudden hush pressed in, heavier than the silence outside, heavier even than the whispers that had followed them from the street. Nicholas stood near the doorway, his hand brushing the frame as if to anchor himself. The air carried a mix of starch, soap, and something faintly metallic, old nails in the wood, years of use. Isaiah set the bowl of stew down on the scarred wooden table. He did it carefully, almost reverently, like a man laying down a gift far more precious than it was. His hands shook faintly as he lowered it, but his face stayed calm. He whispered a quiet grace, not for show, not for Nicholas, not even for the neighbors who had given the food, but for the simple fact that there was something to eat. Nicholas's eyes traveled across the room. The curtains were faded but hand-stitched, the stitches uneven but strong. The old fan turned slow, squeaking with every pass, the same rhythm it had carried when he was a boy lying awake on hot nights. The mug on the counter, chipped at the rim, was the same one his father had used every morning. Nothing had changed except the years carved into Isaiah's face. Nicholas stepped closer to the table, his fingers trailing along the wood. The surface was marked with scars, knife lines, oil stains, burns that never came out. He traced them with his palm like reading a map. Each one carried a story. Dinners stretched thin. Nights his father had made bread from almost nothing. Mornings when laughter tried to fill the emptiness hunger left behind. He could almost hear it again. The hum of the sewing machine, the cough muffled behind a closed door, the quiet muttering his father did when he worked past midnight. Memory pressed down on him. He saw himself as a boy, shoes too tight but new, a satchel of books slung over his shoulder. He remembered looking back at Isaiah bent over that machine, glasses slipping down his nose, fingers raw but steady. He remembered the way his father would wave him off, smiling though his plate had barely been touched. "Eat, son. You need it more than I do." Nicholas blinked hard, his vision blurring. He sat slowly at the table, elbows heavy on the surface, his chest tight as if the house itself was demanding he remember. Isaiah dipped a piece of bread into the thin broth, lifting it to his lips with steady patience. His hands trembled, but he smiled faintly, the same smile he'd used years ago when Nicholas came home with bruised knees or failed grades. The smile that said, "It will be fine. We'll find a way." But Nicholas saw what lay beneath, the hollow cheeks that had once hidden behind that smile, the hunger disguised as contentment, the sacrifices no one had applauded. The neighbors' whispers weren't just gossip, they were reminders. His father had poured everything into him, even when the world called it foolish. Outside, faint voices carried through the thin walls. "You know, Bennett gave up everything for that boy. And where was the boy when the old man needed him? He'll come home when there's a camera." Nicholas clenched his jaw. His hand curled into a fist on the table. He could almost rise, almost fling the door open and scream the truth, that this man had given him everything, that no contract, no empire, no dollar earned could outweigh the nights his father had gone to bed hungry so he could walk into classrooms full. Instead, he stayed. The silence between them grew thick, alive with unspoken words. Nicholas dragged a hand down his face, his breath ragged, eyes stinging. His chest ached with more than guilt. It was clarity, sharp, and brutal. Isaiah lifted another spoonful of stew, sipping quietly. His eyes flicked to Nicholas, studying him for a long moment. And then he smiled, soft and steady, the same smile that had carried them both through storms. Nicholas felt the tears finally break free. He pressed his palms together, elbows on the table, his head lowered as if in prayer. But it wasn't prayer. It was surrender, to the memories, to the guilt, to the man across from him who had once starved himself, so Nicholas never had to. For the first time in years, Nicholas wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't the man from magazines or the face on screens. He was just a son, sitting at his father's old kitchen table and realizing that no amount of wealth could rewrite the sacrifices carved into this house. The old fan groaned overhead, its tired blade slicing the heavy air in slow, uneven arcs. The stew sat between them on the scarred table, cooling with every tick of silence. Nicholas sat hunched, palms pressed together, forehead bowed as though the wood beneath him had become an altar. His chest rose and fell unsteadily, the breaths of a man carrying too much weight. Isaiah chewed slowly, dipping bread into the thin broth with the same patience he had always shown. His hands trembled, his shoulders slumped, but his face carried only calm. He caught his son's stare and offered a small smile, the same gentle curve of lips he had used decades ago whenever Nicholas came home beaten down by life. A smile that said, "We'll find a way." But Nicholas couldn't bear it. The smile felt like a knife, not because it was cruel, but because it was too kind, too undeserved. His throat tightened, his eyes burned, and when his voice finally escaped, it cracked open like a dam. "I left you here," he whispered, the words rasping low, almost swallowed by the whir of the fan. His head shook slowly. "I left you hungry." Isaiah waved a hand, dismissive, chuckling softly as though brushing away a cobweb. "Son, don't shame yourself. You were building. That's what I wanted for you." The quiet acceptance only deepened Nicholas's anguish. He slammed his palm flat against the table, the sound echoing sharp through the small house. The stew trembled in its bowl. Outside, the whispers picked up immediately. "Did you hear that?" He's arguing with the old man now. No, listen to his tone. That's guilt. That's a son realizing what he's missed. Nicholas's voice rose, ragged, shaking. "You gave me everything, Dad. You starved so I could eat. You worked yourself to the bone so I could walk into rooms I never deserved. And where was I? Where was I when you needed someone just to sit beside you?" His shoulders shook as tears slipped free, hot and unrelenting, darkening the wood beneath his hands. The billionaire mask, polished, invincible, crumbled in front of the one man who had seen through it all along. Isaiah's spoon tapped the side of the bowl gently. He leaned forward, his voice steady, almost amused at the storm unraveling across from him. "Nicholas, listen to me. I didn't do it so you'd sit here crying for me. I did it because love doesn't need thanks, it just gives." The words landed like a blow and a balm all at once. Nicholas bent lower, his forehead nearly brushing the knuckles of the hand Isaiah stretched across the table. His father's fingers were rough, nails short, calloused from decades of work. The warmth was faint now, weaker than Nicholas remembered, but it was steady. It was still his father's hand. He pressed his face against it, breathing in the faint scent of soap clinging to his father's skin, mixed with the earthy weight of years. That smell had followed him as a boy, clinging to his shirts, comforting him in the dark. Now he wanted it to last forever. "Outside, Mrs." And Dorsey hushed the men by the hedge, but even she couldn't stop whispering to her neighbor. "Look at him. All the money in the world, and he's still that boy in Mr. Bennett's shadow." The neighbor's reply was soft, almost reverent. "Sometimes it takes a lifetime to see who really raised you." Nicholas straightened, his face streaked but unashamed now. He wiped at his eyes roughly, though the tears kept coming. His voice came out raw, breaking, but it carried conviction. "I don't care about the empire, the headlines, the contracts. None of it matters if the man who made me is left begging on a neighbor's porch." Isaiah didn't flinch. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, etched deep into every wrinkle of his face, every scar across his hands. The silence that followed was thick, alive, humming with something bigger than both of them. Nicholas inhaled, ragged but steadier now, and for the first time since he had stepped from the car, his back straightened with something other than practiced pride. He wasn't a CEO here. He wasn't the billionaire on magazine covers. He was just a son, broken open, finally seeing the cost of the life he lived, and finally ready to pay it back. Nicholas pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching against the worn floorboards. His breath was unsteady, his face streaked, but something in his posture had shifted. He was no longer hunched with shame. He was bracing himself, rising as if the weight of years had finally driven him to his feet. Isaiah looked up at him, calm, spoon still in hand. His eyes followed his son with quiet patience as though waiting to see which way the storm would turn. Nicholas stood tall, his chest heaving, his hands trembling but clenched with resolve. He looked down at his father, then to the old table scarred with knife marks and oil stains, and his voice broke through the silence, low but steady. "No more scraps," he said. The words were sharp, like iron hammered against an anvil. Isaiah blinked, brows furrowing faintly. Nicholas's voice grew louder, cracking at the edges but carrying a conviction he hadn't found until now. No more quiet suffering. No more empty nights. "Dad," he swallowed hard, the word catching, heavy with years of neglect. "You're coming home with me." The sentence rang in the small room like a bell. Outside, the murmurs began again, the neighbors unable to hold back. "Did you hear that?" He said no more scraps. Is he serious, taking him with him? He should have done it years ago. Nicholas didn't care. For once, the whispers didn't drive him down. They drove him forward. He turned back to his father, his eyes wet but blazing now. "I swear to you," he said louder this time, his voice shaking the walls, "I will never let you stand on anyone's porch begging again." The neighbors fell silent. Even the ones hidden behind curtains stopped breathing. The street, nosy and hungry for spectacle, suddenly had nothing left to say. Isaiah set his spoon down gently, his hand resting on the edge of the bowl. His lips parted, trembling faintly. For a moment, it seemed he might protest, might say something about pride or dignity, might wave his son's vow away the same way he had waved away his own hunger for years. But the look in Nicholas's eyes stopped him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was a son standing in the only truth that mattered. Nicholas bent suddenly, awkwardly, desperately, and pressed his lips to the rough knuckles of his father's hand. His shoulders shook, his voice breaking against the skin he once held so small in his own. "I can't undo the years, but I can carry you now. Let me carry you." Isaiah exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with the weight of acceptance. His fingers tightened faintly around his son's hand, weak but steady. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to lean, just slightly, into someone else's strength. The house held its breath. The street outside held its breath. Even the fan overhead seemed to slow in reverence. Nicholas straightened, wiping at his face, though the tears refused to stop. He stood taller than he had in years, but it wasn't the proud posture of a billionaire. It was the stance of a son who had finally come home. The vow had been spoken, and this time, it wasn't a promise delayed by business, by quarters, by empires. It was now. It was forever. Isaiah's lips trembled, his eyes shining with something deeper than relief. Not pride, not even joy, but peace. The kind a man feels when the long wait is finally over. Nicholas did not wait another second. The words still hung in the air, heavy and ringing, but his body had already decided. He moved around the table, his steps deliberate, the floor groaning beneath his weight. The bowl of stew, now forgotten, sat cooling in the middle of the table, but neither man looked at it again. Isaiah started to rise, his hands pressing against the chair for leverage. His legs trembled, slower than they once were, but his posture was still proud. Nicholas reached for him immediately, steadying him with a grip both firm and gentle. Their eyes met, Isaiah's holding quiet resistance, Nicholas's blazing with determination. "Not another word," Nicholas whispered, his voice steady now, commanding without arrogance. "This isn't charity. This is family." Isaiah's lips parted, as if to argue, but no protest came. Instead, he gave a faint nod, surrendering not to weakness, but to the bond that had never broken, no matter how many years of silence stretched between them. Nicholas guided him toward the door. His hand rested under his father's elbow, his other hand lightly at his back. Every movement was careful, reverent, as though he were carrying something far more precious than gold. The old wooden door creaked open. Sunlight spilled across the porch, illuminating them in a glow that made the moment almost holy. The whispers outside stilled, replaced by a hush so complete it felt like the whole street had drawn one breath and held it. And then they appeared. Isaiah leaning slightly against his son, Nicholas holding him as though he were the most valuable man in the world. The neighbors straightened, caught between disbelief and awe. One muttered, "Never thought I'd see him carry anyone but himself." Another shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. "That's not just carrying, that's repaying." Nicholas didn't look at them. His eyes never left his. "Father." The gravel crunched beneath their feet, each step echoing like a drumbeat of redemption. Isaiah tried once to slow, to take the walk on his own strength, but Nicholas's grip tightened, unyielding. "I've got you," he said softly, a promise more solid than steel. They reached the waiting car. The chauffeur, already out and holding the door, froze when Nicholas lifted a hand and gestured him back. This moment was not for staff, not for strangers. This was between father and son. Nicholas opened the door himself, lowering into a crouch so that his eyes met Isaiah's on level ground. The billionaire mask was gone. His face was raw, unguarded, streaked with tears that had dried but left their marks. His voice was steady though, every word carved from truth. "You'll live with me now. No more scraping, no more loneliness. You'll eat at my table, in my house, and every person I meet will know the name Isaiah Bennett, because you are the reason I breathe." Isaiah's lips trembled. His eyes shone, not with the pride of being seen, not even with relief of being saved, but with something gentler, peace. The long wait, the years of sacrifice and silence, had finally found their answer. Nicholas eased him into the car, careful as though lowering a crown onto a king. He shut the door softly, not with the finality of leaving, but with the promise of beginning again. The neighbors watched in silence, no longer gossips, no longer judges. They had witnessed something they couldn't mock, something too human, too sacred. And as the sleek black car pulled away from the worn curb, the sun caught in its reflection, carrying with it not just a billionaire and his father, but a story the street would never forget. The car glided up the long drive like a shadow slipping across glass. The mansion rose ahead, all gleaming stone and manicured lawns, windows catching the last light of day until they looked like fire. It was a place that had hosted leaders, celebrities, men and women whose names carried weight in every corner of the world. Tonight, though, its grandeur felt different. Tonight, it was simply waiting for the quiet steps of a man who had never asked for anything. The chauffeur hurried forward, but Nicholas raised a hand to stop him. He circled the car himself, opening the door and offering his hand. Isaiah hesitated a beat, looking up at the sprawling house as though it were a mirage. His shoes, worn thin and split at the seams, touched marble steps not built for men like him. His lips pressed together tightly, as though swallowing back the instinct to protest. Nicholas steadied him with one arm, guiding him up each step. For every slow shuffle Isaiah took, Nicholas matched it, patient and steady. To the staff waiting at the doors, polished uniforms, perfect posture, it was a sight that unsettled them. They had seen their employer command governments with a glance, close deals worth billions with a smile. They had never seen him this way, shoulders bent in service, every movement humble. Inside, the air shifted. Chandeliers glowed overhead, scattering light across marble floors so clean they reflected every step. The dining hall opened wide, its tables stretching the length of the room, gleaming under silver cutlery and china that had never known hunger. Tonight it was set not for guests, not for leaders, not for any of the world's powerful, but for one man, the man who had once bowed his head over scraps on a neighbor's porch. Isaiah stopped at the threshold, his breath catching, his hand pressed faintly against Nicholas's arm. He whispered almost to himself, "This is too much." Nicholas bent closer, his voice steady, unshakable. "No, Dad, this is what you deserve." He led him to the head of the table, not to the side, not as a guest, but as the man of honor. Isaiah sat slowly, his hands trembling against the polished wood. Servants moved like shadows, bringing dishes that steamed with richness, food that filled the air with warmth, roast meats, fresh bread, fruits that shone like jewels, plates that overflowed without fear of empty tomorrow. But Isaiah, even here, bowed his head. His voice, quiet but clear, filled the space. "Lord, thank you for this food. Thank you for the hands that provided it, and thank you for the son who remembers." Nicholas did not eat. He couldn't. His chest ached with something too heavy, too sacred. He watched instead, the way his father's lips curved faintly as he tasted food rich enough to make a king weep, the way his hands, though frail, still carried dignity in every movement. Tears pricked Nicholas's eyes again, though this time they weren't born of guilt alone. They came from the sight of restoration, from the relief that perhaps it wasn't too late. He leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Isaiah, and in that moment, surrounded by marble and chandeliers, Nicholas realized something so simple it hollowed him out. All the empires, all the contracts, all the wealth meant nothing if it wasn't here, in service of the man who had built his life with empty stomachs and sleepless nights. The room was silent except for the sound of Isaiah chewing slowly, savoring each bite as if it were treasure. The chandeliers glowed brighter, as though the house itself had found its missing heart. For the first time in years, Nicholas wasn't haunted by what he had failed to do. For the first time, he was present, truly present. And as the night stretched on, father and son shared a meal, not just of food, but of years of love, of promises finally kept. The gala hall shimmered with gold light, crystal chandeliers raining brilliance down on polished marble. The air was thick with perfume, murmurs of the powerful, the rustle of gowns and the weight of tuxedos. Cameras lined the walls like sentries, their lenses hungry. It was the kind of evening where fortunes mingled, where headlines were born. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Nicholas Hale stood at the podium, his hand resting not on notes, not on polished speeches, but on the shoulder of the frail man seated beside him. The crowd shifted uneasily, their whispers rippling like wind through tall grass. They were used to seeing Nicholas announce mergers, unveil innovations, command governments with a smile. They were not used to this, a billionaire standing with eyes rimmed red, a man's hand clutched as though it were the only anchor in the world. Nicholas cleared his throat, the microphone catching the tremor in his breath. He looked out at the sea of faces, investors, politicians, admirers, critics. For once, their judgment didn't matter. His gaze dropped to Isaiah, who sat upright despite his trembling hands, dressed in a simple suit Nicholas had insisted on, though he had tried to argue against it. The old man's eyes, humble and steady, told him what no boardroom ever had: speak the truth. Nicholas's voice, when it came, was raw. "This man," he began, his palm tightening against Isaiah's shoulder, "taught me the meaning of wealth." The murmurs grew louder, uncertain. Nicholas pressed on. "When you see me on magazine covers, when you read about the companies I've built, the fortunes I've made, understand this: I am nothing more than the shadow of his sacrifice." Gasps rippled through the room. Isaiah bowed his head slightly, as though embarrassed to be so exposed under chandeliers meant for kings. Nicholas didn't let the silence settle. "He fed me when he was starving. He clothed me when he was bare. When the world told him I wasn't his blood, when they said he was wasting his life on me, he worked harder. He sold the only cow he owned to pay for my exam fees. He tightened his belt while loosening my future, and I—" His voice cracked. He stopped, swallowing hard, the weight of confession almost choking him. "I left him behind. I let him bow his head on porches for scraps. And tonight, I say it in front of all of you, never again." The crowd fell into stunned silence. No clink of glasses, no polite applause, just the raw quiet of people hearing something too human to brush aside. Nicholas's eyes gleamed as he leaned closer to the microphone. "You celebrate me as a billionaire, but the truth is, the man beside me is the one who built everything. Not with money, not with power, but with love and sacrifice. And tonight, I will tell you what I've never said publicly before." The room leaned in, breathless. "I am adopted. This man is not my blood, but he is my father. He is my beginning, my foundation, my everything. His name is Isaiah Bennett, and if you remember me, remember him first." A collective gasp surged through the hall. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras clicked like storms, and yet the sound seemed small compared to the thunder of Nicholas's words. Isaiah's eyes brimmed, his lips trembling. Not pride, not surprise, peace, as though all the years of quiet sacrifice, all the nights of hunger and silence, had finally been seen under the brightest lights in the world. Nicholas straightened, his hand never leaving his father's. His voice softened, but the microphone carried every word. "You see a man who built an empire. I see the man who built me. Without him, there is nothing. And from this night forward, I will spend every breath making sure the world knows it." The hall rose in silence. No applause, not yet. Just the stunned stillness of hundreds of powerful people realizing they were watching something greater than wealth, greater than success. They were watching redemption. And as the cameras flashed, the world saw not a billionaire on a stage, but a son finally lifting his father higher than himself.